The rock does not care who you are. That is what Yochanan had learned in his years on Patmos. The island receives emperors and exiles with the same indifference. The wind off the Aegean hits the stone cliffs and breaks apart, and the sound it makes is something between a moan and a roar, and it does not stop. Not at night, not at dawn, not on the day of the Lord, when an old man knelt alone on a ridge above the water and felt something inside his chest begin to open like a door. He had been on the island long enough to know its moods. The sea that morning was the color of iron, the sky pressing down low and heavy, and the waves broke against the shore with the kind of violence that made you feel small in a way that was not entirely unpleasant. There is a particular grace in being reminded of your own size. Yochanan had learned that too. He was old. His hands, when he spread them out before him in prayer, were the hands of a man who had held a fishing net, and then held something far heavier, and the weight of both was written into every line of his skin. He was not praying for rescue. He had passed through that season long ago. He was simply present. Kneeling on the stone, the wind pulling at his cloak, his eyes closed, his mouth still. And then the stillness inside him broke open, and he was somewhere else entirely. What came first was the sound. Not the Aegean, not the wind, but something that contained both and exceeded both, a resonance that began in his bones before it reached his ears. He felt the ground beneath him and could not tell if it was the rock of Patmos or something older than any island. And then the throne, and then the scroll, and then the Lamb, and the first seal. He had read Zechariah. Every child of Israel who had learned to read had read Zechariah. He knew the riders in the night, the man on the red horse standing among the myrtle trees, the patrols sent through the earth to walk back and forth across it. He knew Yechezkel too, and the four judgments, the sword and the famine and the pestilence and the wild beasts, the four instruments that a covenant God had always used when a people forgot who they belonged to. He knew this language. His people had been reading it for centuries. So when the first rider came, Yochanan recognized him the way you recognize a word in your mother tongue spoken in a foreign country, with a jolt and then a deep, settling certainty. The white horse moved like light across still water, and the rider carried a bow. Not a sword, a bow, the weapon of distance, the weapon of the nations that swept down from beyond the horizon, before you could see their faces. The rider wore a crown, not the diadem of a king enthroned, but the Stephanos, the wreath of a victor already crowned in the moment of his going out. Yochanan watched him ride and understood. This was not a savior. This was not a villain from some distant age. This was the ancient face of conquest itself, the force that empires ride when they are swollen with certainty, when they go out telling themselves they carry order into chaos. He had seen that face on Roman soldiers at the harbor. The second seal opened, and the red horse came, and the rider took peace from the earth, and men began to kill one another. There was no mystery here, no code to decipher. Yochanan knew what war looked like. He had outlived men who had not run fast enough from Jerusalem. He had heard what happened in the year the city burned. The red horse was not coming. It had already been, and it was always coming again, because that is what war does. It is never fully past. It is only resting. The third rider carried scales. The voice from among the four living creatures spoke of wheat and barley and oil and wine, of what a day's wages could and could not buy. Yochanan thought of the grain markets in Ephesus. He thought of the way prices climbed when the legions needed feeding. He thought of the farmers who grew the food and could not afford to eat it, and the merchants who sold it and bought themselves houses near the Forum. The black horse did not need to arrive from somewhere else. It walked the streets of every city he had ever visited. And the fourth, the pale horse, whose rider's name was Death, and Hades following close behind. Yochanan watched them given authority over a quarter of the earth, with sword and famine and pestilence and the wild beasts. He recognized those 4 words. Yechezkel had listed them. They were the covenant curses, the ancient reckoning that fell on people who forgot the terms of their belonging. They were not novelties. They were the oldest grammar in the Hebrew library of judgment. He stayed there in the vision for a long time, long enough to understand what the scrolls he had memorized in his boyhood had been preparing him to see. The writers were not strangers. They were the story his people had always told about what happens to nations that devour the weak and call it peace, that build empires on bones and call it civilization. The language of apocalypse was not a new language. It was the oldest language dressed in new urgency, written for people living under the shadow of an emperor who called himself a god and expected you to agree. Yochanan was on Patmos because he had disagreed. When he came back to the rock and the wind and the iron-colored sea, he sat for a while without moving. His knees ached. The waves were still breaking against the shore below him with the same indifferent violence. The sky had not changed. He had changed, or rather, something inside him had settled into a new arrangement, the way stones shift after an earthquake and find a configuration that holds. He reached for the reed and the parchment he had brought with him. He began to write, not because he expected everyone to understand, not because the words would be easy to receive, but because the vision had been given to him in the language of his fathers, and his fathers had always written things down, even in exile, especially in exile, so that the ones who came after would know that the forces tearing the world apart had names, and the names were old, and the one who sat above them all was older still. The wind did not stop. He kept writing,